The lynching of Emmett Till. 3,446 African Americans were lynched between 1882 and 1968. Lynching, a killing without a trial, often by a mob, was a product of racial tensions when white people thought newly freed African Americans were gaining too much freedom and that they needed to be restrained or controlled. One of these victims was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago named Emmet Till. In 1955, after whistling at a white woman, he was kidnapped in the middle of the night, tortured, then shot in the head. He was attached to a cotton gin fan with barbed wire and dumped in the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi. When he was found, he was only recognized by a ring on his finger because his face was so deformed. His murder was unbelievably atrocious, and this got people's attention. The brutal lynching of Emmet Till sparked the civil rights movement as it focused media attention and rallied support from Americans across the country, leading to laws and regulations protecting African Americans. The Emmet Till lynching was unique because of the massive attention from both white and black media. Emmet Till was from Chicago, only visiting cousins in Mississippi for the summer. He didn't know how fragile the relationship between white and black people was. Many people were captivated by the incident and how it could happen to someone a lot like themselves. It was difficult to believe that something this horrific was happening in their own country. His murder was so brutal that the sheriff testified that when he found Emmet Till's body, the skin had slipped. I would say it had slipped on the entire body. The fingernails were gone from the left hand. The left eyeball was almost out, almost enough to fall out, and the right one was out, I would say about 3/4 of an inch. The American public struggled to believe that this could even happen. Emmet Till was abducted in the middle of the night in full view of his cousins, his uncle, and his aunt, who begged for his kidnappers to let him go. It was a scene that was devastating to picture, a loved one being taken, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. The abduction and murder struck a nerve in people throughout the nation. Soon the word got around, and papers with news on the tragedy started flying off the shelves. Editions of Jet magazine, a popular African-American magazine with photos of his mutilated body, sold out and they had to print more. Everyone was struck by this tragedy. The media coverage of this event was unprecedented. More than 100 news media outlets covered the Emmet Till trial. Rarely were there times when a story was, as Jackson House put it, headline news for both blacks and whites. White newspapers often did not cover civil rights issues the way that black newspapers did. Many white Northerners had no idea what black people were dealing with in the South, but the lynching of Emmet Till helped change that. The story was pivotal for black journalists. Authors of The Race Beat, The Press, The Civil Rights Struggle, and The Awakening of a Nation, Gene Roberts and Hank Klibbenop, said that Emmet Till's death was able to bring black reporters into the heart of the white man's kingdom, the courtroom, but he brought white reporters into the Deep South in unprecedented numbers to cover a racial story. This was one of the first times that white and black Americans were both outraged at a racial injustice. The northern United States was finally getting a taste of the magnitude of racism in the Deep South. Comedian and activist Dick Gregory, who was 23 at the time, stated, "The center of gravity was Emmet Till. It was a different type of story. It was the first time those of us who lived in the North felt a kinship. It was a shocker." People in the United States were shocked at what was happening to other Americans in their own country. They felt a call to action because of what they were seeing in the media. After her famous bus protest, Rosa Parks told reporters, "I thought of Emmet Till, and when the bus driver ordered me to move to the back, I just couldn't move." The media coverage of Emmet Till made more people, especially Northerners, aware of the issues in the Deep South. People cared enough about him that they traveled across the country to support him and the growing cause that he represented. Emmet was beginning to stand as a symbol for the effects of deep-seated American racism. People were appalled at the horrendous state of his swollen, mutilated body. Emmet Till's cousin, Wheeler Parker, who was at the funeral, recounted, "The air was filled with just, I guess, unbelief, and how could it happen to a kid? people just felt helpless. They were stunned that something this unbelievably horrible could happen to a child. After viewing Till's body, many people broke into tears and even fainted. The Reverend Jesse Jackson called it the movement's Big Bang. Emmett Till's ordeal was the event that made the civil rights movement really take off. The effect Emmett Till's body had on people led to even more action being taken. The outrage only grew when Emmett Till's murderers were acquitted despite overwhelming evidence, including eyewitness accounts against them. After his killer's acquittal, a white reporter who was present at the trial called the verdict the most revolting, the most disgusting, the most callous miscarriage of justice that has been my lot in more than 20 years of crime reporting. After such an awful, unfair result, many protests began. The Los Angeles Times reported that in Chicago, 20,000 protested the acquittal, along with another 10,000 in Harlem. The NAACP, the Jewish Labor Committee, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters all held demonstrations. People of all walks of life cared about the injustices that Emmett Till and other African Americans had faced. There was even international protests in Paris, Norway, and the Kremlin. No matter who they were or where they were from, people cared about the cause that Emmett Till represented. Not only were people learning about the injustices that African Americans faced, but they were taking action as well. People's outrage over what they had seen is best exemplified through what Simeon Wright, Emmett's cousin who was with him at the time of the kidnapping, explained. When they saw what happened, this motivated a lot of people that were standing what we call on the fence against racism. It encouraged them to get in the fight and do something about it. That's why many say that was the beginning of the civil rights era. Emmett Till pushed people over the edge and helped jumpstart the civil rights movement. David Beto, a professor of history at University of Alabama, clarified, "There was a civil rights movement before Emmett Till came along, but the outrage galvanized the movement in ways that hadn't occurred before." Emmett Till gave Americans the last push they needed to form a stronger, more cohesive civil rights movement and led to changes. The abhorrent lynching of Emmett Till is still called on today as a prime example of the terrible effect of racism in America. It is a reminder of a sad period of the country's history, but is often compared to more recent cases of brutality against young African Americans, such as when Trayvon Martin was killed by a neighbor as he was walking in his father's neighborhood in 2012. He was only 17 and completely unarmed. Chicago State University professor Kelly Harris commented, "Emmett Till was Trayvon Martin before Trayvon Martin." Even in a seemingly fair world, African Americans are still victim to racially motivated crimes not unlike what Emmett Till experienced. Kelly Harris's colleague, Professor Lionel Kimball, echoed her sentiments. Given what's going on with the number of unarmed African Americans being essentially lynched in modern America, I think Emmett Till should be brought back to the national attention. Though it has been 63 years since his death, Emmett Till's story is startlingly relevant compared to recent killings of African Americans. While there are still major issues with America today, Emmett Till's slaying made a tremendous impact on civil rights for African Americans. Emmett Till's death shocked the nation, and with that shock, the civil rights movement began gaining traction. The more attention people paid to the underlying racial issues, the more attention the government paid as well. An LA Times article argued the case gave civil rights advocates a martyr and ambivalent politicians an impetus to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which created the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division and laid the foundation for a series of historic voting rights laws. Emmett Till's horrific death provided people an incentive to make real change in America.